Introducing Group Policy. Group Policy is a method of configuring various options in your domain, such as controlling what your users can or cannot do in your network. Configuring Group Policy at a site or a domain or an OU level enables an administrator to configure things that will filter down to all of the computers in your enterprise and control things like security, file and folder permissions, and even the way a user's desktop appears. In fact, there's so much that you can achieve using Group Policy that it's impossible to cover every single policy in these videos. But if you have an idea, hey, could I prevent users from doing this or accessing that? Well, you'll probably find that there's a policy already written to do exactly what you want. In Windows 2008, there's been a few changes to Group Policy, but the most notable change is that the Group Policy Management Console, or GPMC, which was available as a download for Windows Server 2003, is now built into Windows 2008, and if you've ever done much work with group policies before, you'll no doubt agree that the Group Policy Management Console is a much better tool for managing policies than what we had before. Back in Windows 2000, understanding which group policy objects were being applied to users and computers was often difficult to identify, especially in a complex hierarchy of OUs and policies, so it was difficult to find out what the final policy that a client will actually receive. In Windows Server 2008, we have the ability to use a Group Policy Results wizard, which addresses this problem by generating a report detailing what policies a user or computer will actually receive. We also have the ability to predict what effects changes to a user or computer's policy will have on our environment by running through a Group Policy Modeling wizard, and that will generate another report telling us that if we were to make changes to a policy, how it's going to affect the user or computer without us actually having to make that change. Now, Group Policy Objects, or GPOs, can either be local to a particular computer or domain-based policies that are present in an Active Directory domain. With local policies, the policy itself is stored locally on each computer, whether the computer is part of an Active Directory domain or not, and it will only affect the computer on which the local policy is stored. Each computer will have its own local policy, which can be different on each machine. Non-local or domain group policy objects are created in Active Directory and are linked to an OU, a site, or a domain in order to be applied to a whole bunch of different targets at once. So let's start with taking a brief look at local GPOs. So on our Windows 2008 server here, to access the local policy, we'll click on Start, we'll go to Administrative Tools, and then we'll choose Local Security Policy. Now from this console, we've got a bunch of different policy objects that we're able to configure on this machine only that allow us to lock down and secure what people are able to do on this machine, or we could go the other way and relax our security and settings so that users are pretty much able to do what they want. Now, we're not going to spend any great deal of time in this console here, since the purpose of these videos are based around domain policies, but truth be told, most of what you're going to see here is pretty much identical to what you'll configure using domain policies. The only difference, of course, is that domain policies can target more than one user or computer at a time, unlike this local security policy, which only covers this machine. So for example, on the left-hand side, if we expand one of these, say local policies, and then select one of the other subcategories here, in the right-hand side of this console, we have a bunch of different policy objects we can configure about what sort of security options we'll use on this computer. So to configure or disable a policy from applying, we'll right-click on any of them and choose Properties. Now, a lot of the policies here will have different options, by the way. Some will only allow you to enable or disable a feature. Others, like this policy here, has a drop-down box where we could limit this task to administrators and other groups. So by default, with this particular policy we've chosen, anyone can format and eject removable media, but we could choose to lock it down so that people without higher privileges can't do it. So remember that any settings you configure here using local group policy objects are applied only to the local computer and not any other computers in your domain. So with that in mind, let's now go and take an in-depth look at non-local group policy objects or domain policies. After all, that's where you'll be spending most of your time as an administrator. Before we actually get into the business of configuring policies, let's take a look at how policies are actually applied, because understanding this information can be pivotal to successfully rolling out an efficient and working policy structure. The first policy to be applied at a computer that's a member of an Active Directory domain is the local policy that we just looked at. Every Windows 2008 computer has exactly one local group policy object stored on the local computer. Now, once the local policy's been applied to a computer, the next policy to be applied are group policy objects that have been linked at a site that the computer is a member of. Group policy objects are applied synchronously, meaning at the same time, and if there's more than one site policy, an administrator can specify the order in which site policies can be applied. Now next, domain-based policies are applied. Like with our site policies, domain policies are applied synchronously, and administrators can specify the order in which they're applied. And finally, policies that are defined at the organizational unit or OU are then applied, and if multiple GPOs are linked to an OU, then they're also applied synchronously until all policies have been applied. Now, if there are child OUs inside of other OUs, then the policies linked to the OU at the top of the hierarchy is applied first, with all child OU policies being applied in order. Now, this policy order from local through to OU means that policies that conflict with each other are overwritten by the next policy in line. So, when a site policy is applied, if an identical local policy has already been applied and the site policy has conflicting settings, the site policy will win, and whatever settings that you've configured in the site policy, they'll override the settings in the local policy. Similarly, when a domain policy is applied and it has settings that conflict with site policies, the domain policy will be the winner and its settings will overwrite the site policy settings. And of course, policies at the OU level will of course override domain policies, and child OU policies will override the parent OU policies, and so on until there's no more child OUs. So if, for example, we'd configured a policy at the domain level that allowed a user to perform some sort of function, but our policy at the OU level denied the user the ability to perform that same function, then the user would be denied permission to perform the task as the OU policy would win. Now, when policies are applied, they can be targeted at a computer or a user. And if a conflict exists between a computer setting and a user configuration setting, then the computer configuration setting will win, and that will be applied as computer policies are more specific. In Windows 2003, when we wanted to create or edit group policy objects, we'd go and open up Active Directory Users and Computers, and we'd right-click on an OU and choose Properties, and then go to the Group Policy tab. Or if we wanted to apply policies at the site level, we'd right-click on a site and choose Properties, and we'd also go to the Group Policy tab. But in Windows 2008, we'll do things differently. In Windows Server 2008, you'll notice that if we right-click on an OU and choose Properties, that there is no Group Policy tab. And in fact, if we go and open up our Sites and Services console and expand our site, and we'll right-click on a site and choose Properties, you'll notice again, we don't have a Group Policy tab here either. Well, in Windows 2008, Microsoft have included the Group Policy Management console, known as the GPMC, and that's where we'll now create and link group policy objects to sites, domains, and OUs. So we'll go and click on Start, we'll go to Administrative Tools, and we'll launch Group Policy Management. Now on the left-hand side of this console, we'll expand Forest, and we have 4 containers here for our domains, our sites, Group Policy Modeling, and Group Policy Results. Now, these last 2 containers here, Group Policy Modeling and Group Policy Results, we'll be talking about in another video, so we're going to ignore them here for now But under our domains and sites containers is where we're going to create and link policies to any domain in our forest or any site. So let's expand domains, and then our domain here, winstructorlab.com, and this will show us the OUs that we have inside this domain. We can also see the default domain policy, which is directly linked to our domain, winstructorlab.com. And down the bottom here, we have a couple of other containers, group policy objects, which is a central container for every group policy object in this domain, Wmi Filters, which are queries that we can write to help us target certain machines in our domain that we want to apply filters to, and starter Gpos, which we can use to create group policy objects that are kind of like templates that we can apply to other policies. So we have two default policies here. The default domain policy, which we can see listed here at the root of our OU hierarchy, and if we expand the domain controllers OU, we also have the default domain controllers policy. Now you recall that we have three places that we can link policies to. We have the domain, OUs, and sites. Now when you want to create a group policy object at the domain or the OU level, you could simply right-click on either of them and choose to create a GPO here or on a OU. We can do the same there. But if you want to create a policy at your site level, you'll notice that we don't have the option there, so we'll first need to show our sites by right-clicking on sites and choosing Show Sites. Then we'll select the sites that we want to display and click on OK. Now if we go and right-click on any of our sites, we have the ability to link an existing group policy object to our site, but we can't create one from here. But what if you haven't yet created a group policy object that you want to link here? Well, in that case, we'll need to select the group policy objects folder, and in here you'll see all of the group policy objects that we have within this entire domain, and here's the two default ones that we've already talked about. And by the way, you'll notice on the left here we have these little icons under our domain, winstructorlab.com, and our default domain controllers policy. They have this little shortcut icon over them. Well, as that suggests, these are only shortcuts, or links if you like, to the location where the real policies are stored, which is under the group policy objects container. So it doesn't really matter if you create a policy directly on the OU or at the domain level, or you do it here inside the group policy objects container. Either way, it's actually going to be created here anyway. The benefit to creating it at the OU or domain level is that it will also link it to the domain or OU, which you'll have to do manually if you create them inside this container. All right, well, let's first create a policy, and we'll link it to our sites first, so that way you can see how it's done. So we'll right-click on our group policy objects container, and we'll select New. Now we'll need to provide this group policy object with a name, so let's just call it US Site, and then we'll click on OK. Now that our site policy has been created, we can simply right-click on it and choose to edit the policy as we see fit, and make all of the changes that we'd like to see implemented at the site level, and then to apply it, we'll just need to link it to a site. So we'll right-click on our site and choose to link an existing GPO. We'll choose our US site policy and click on OK. And now whatever settings that we define in that policy are going to apply to all objects in our site. Now, like I said a moment ago, if we want to create and link a policy to either the domain or an OU, we'll right-click on one of these, and let's just choose our member servers OU here, and we'll choose the top option to create a GPO in this domain and link it here. And again, we'll need to give this group policy object a name, so I'm going to call this one Servers, and we'll click on OK. Now this time, the policy is not only being created, but if we expand our member servers OU, you can see that it's also automatically been linked here, so it's just taken one less step to achieve. Now that we have a couple of policies created, if we right-click on any of them, and let's use our servers policy here, we could edit the policy settings. We can enforce this policy, which used to be called No Override in earlier versions of Windows Server, and what this setting does is force this policy to be applied regardless of whether or not there are other group policy objects down the line which contain conflicting settings. Now, if you recall earlier in this video, we said that a policy at a child OU, say our DHCP OU here, which sits under our member servers OU, if that has conflicting settings, then the DHCP policy will override the service policy. Well, it's true. It will override it unless you choose to enforce the settings, and that's the only time that rule will be broken. However, you should use this enforced option sparingly, if at all, because it can make troubleshooting policies all the more difficult. Now, on a somewhat related note, if we right-click on our DHCPOU, you'll notice that we have another option here to block inheritance. What this setting does is to block any upstream group policy objects from applying to this OU. So, if I were to set block inheritance here, then the server's OU policy won't apply to this OU unless I have the server's OU policy set to enforced. Then it will apply. So remember, enforced overrides all, even when you choose to block higher level policies from applying. All right, well, let's right-click on our server's policy again, and you'll also notice that this policy is link enabled, which means this policy is active and in effect. And if you wanted to disable this policy, but not delete it, you can just select this option, and it's going to grey out the policy for you to re-enable later on if you need. Now, we could also save a report of all the settings that this policy contains to an HTML file if we like, but we can also view all of these settings directly from this console as well. So if we just select our service policy, and by the way, when you directly select a linked policy, you will get this message here telling you that you've selected a link, and any changes that you make to this policy from this link will affect every location where you're applying this policy. So it's just a warning that if you do decide to change this policy and it's linked to another OU, then that OU is going to be affected by any changes that you make. So I'm just going to check this box here to not show this message again, and we'll click on OK. And if we now go and select the Settings tab, we'll be shown the same report that we could have saved a moment ago when we right-clicked on our policy. But in here, you'll see all of the settings that you've configured in the policy, but since my policy here is a new one with no changes, it's pretty bland. So let's go and click on the default domain policy and have a look at that one, as we will see some sort of configuration changes here. So in here, we can see that some sort of change has been made to policy objects under the computer configuration heading. And if we click on the hyperlinks on the right-hand side, this is going to expand out each heading and show us the subheadings that are underneath and all of the configuration changes that have been made to the policy. So if you're ever wondering what settings a policy object has, you can come in here and you can find out exactly what those settings are. Now, while we're here in this section, let's just go and click on the Scope tab. And here we can choose to display links from our entire forest and other domains if we like. And you can also see with our default domain policy, which is what we currently have selected, it's not being enforced, so settings in here can be overridden at lower levels. It is link enabled, meaning that this policy is active and in use. And of course, it's being applied at our domain controllers OU. Now, when we apply our policies, we can also choose to only apply them to specific users, groups, and computers if we like. And that's useful. For example, let's say that you have every user in your organization and they're all grouped together in the same OU. But you've got sales groups and marketing groups and so forth. Well, you could configure policies with specific settings that you only want to apply to members of certain groups. So you could create a policy and have it apply at the OU that all of these users are in, but the default would be that everyone's going to apply that policy, and that's not what you want. So down here under the security filtering heading, we can click on the Add button and then locate a group, let's say the sales group, and then click on OK, and that'll add them to this list, and then you could simply remove the authenticated users group. And if the users aren't a member of the sales group, then they won't be applying this policy. Now, down the bottom of this window here, we can also use Wmi Filters to provide a similar result to our security filter above, except that with Wmi Filters, we've got even more control over who or what will apply the policy. And we'll come back in a moment, we'll talk more about Wmi Filters. Now the next tab is the Details tab, and here we can see some more information about this policy, such as who owns this policy, when it was created and last modified, and so forth. Now we've already looked at the Settings tab. The next tab is the Delegation tab, where we can specify who has access to this policy. So here we can see authenticated users and our sales group that we just added a moment ago, and they have read access to this policy, which of course was granted from the security filtering section on the Scope tab. But the domain admins, the enterprise admins, they're two other groups that you'll need to be part of in order to create, delete, and modify other policies. But you can use these buttons down the bottom here to add or remove or change the properties of other user accounts and grant them permissions here if you like. All right, well, I said that would come back to Wmi Filters, so let's do that now. And we'll go to our Scope tab. And for those of you that have used Wmi before, you'll know that there isn't much that Wmi can't tell you about a computer. So let's consider a perfectly acceptable example where you may have a specific policy that you only want to apply to computers running Windows Vista. And anyone who might be running Windows XP, for example, you don't want them applying the policy. So on the left-hand side, we'll select Wmi Filters, and we'll right-click and choose to create a new one. And we'll need to give this one a name, so let's just call this one Windows Vista Business. Let's say they're running the Business Edition. Now we can give it an optional description if we like, and I'm going to leave that blank. Now in our queries section, we'll click on the Add button, and then we'll need to write a Wmi query. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Wmi scripting, I'd recommend that you go off to Microsoft's website and download a little tool called Scriptomatic, as it's a great little tool. It's only a couple of 100 kilobytes in size, and it's going to show you all of the Wmi classes available on your system, and it's even going to write most of the query for you. So I'd highly recommend it to anyone who's remotely interested in learning more about Wmi. So for our query though, if we wanted to apply a policy to computers running Windows Vista business operating systems, we would enter something like this. So here we're trying to select all from the Windows 32 operating system class where the caption equals Microsoft Windows Vista Business. So we'll click on OK, and then we'll click Save. All right, there's our Wmi filter. So we can now go and click on one of our policies and go to the Scope tab. And at the bottom, we'll select our drop-down box here, and we can now choose Windows Vista Business. And if we select that, it's going to ask us, are we sure we want to do this? Well, we'll say yes. And now only computers that are running Windows Vista Business as their operating system is going to apply this policy. Although I might point out that applying a Vista Business Wmi filter to my domain controllers is probably not a good idea. But still, Wmi, it's a really cool scripting interface that lets you set some really intricate conditions on whom or what is applying your policy. It really comes down to how specific you want it to be. For example, we could write a Wmi script that says if the computer we're running this policy against isn't Windows Vista Business and doesn't have more than 1 gig of RAM and doesn't have at least 10 gig of free hard disk space, then don't apply the policy. And actually, even though that might seem a tad over the top, we could even get more granular than that if we truly wanted to by using Wmi. So again, if you're not familiar with Wmi, go to Microsoft's website, download that Scriptomatic tool, and start learning about it, and you'll be certainly glad that you did. Now, the last container that we're going to look at in this video is the Starter Gpos container. And if we click on that, you'll notice that we don't have any created by default, but we do have this big button here, which tells us that it will create one. So if we click on this, what it's actually done is to create a new folder called Starter Gpos within our sysvol folder. So if we go and click on Start, and we'll open up Computer, and we'll navigate to a folder called DCO1, which is the name of this computer, followed by sysvol folder. And then we'll go into our domain, winstructorlab.com, and here you can see the Starter Gpos folder. And this is where any Starter Gpos we create will be stored, and they'll be replicated to other domain controllers in our network. So let's go back to our console. And these Starter Gpos are really just templates, if you like, that we can create and then use them as a baseline for new group policy objects. So let's say that we're going to create a policy for our DNS servers. Now we're also probably going to want to create group policy objects for our DHCP servers, our file servers, our print servers, our web servers, and so forth. And it's likely that much of the same policies are going to be configured across all of these OUs. Now sure, there will be many settings that'll be different, and that's why we've logically separated our OUs in the first place. But there will be a lot of baseline settings that will want to be the same, no matter what server role we'll be installing. So let's right-click on Starter GPOs and we'll choose New, and we'll need to give this Starter GPO a name, so let's just call this one Server Role Baseline. And we can add in some comments as well if we like. And now we'll go and click on OK. And here we can see our new Starter GPO. Now if we right click on it and then choose Edit, this will fire up the Group Policy Object Editor, where we can now drill down into the various policy objects and then configure it the way that we'd like. Now, you may notice that there are a few containers here that are missing. Things like software settings and Windows settings, which aren't available in Starter GPOs, but most of the generic things that you want are here in this baseline policy. So let's just make a change to this policy. That way we can at least see it working later on. So under our computer configuration, let's expand administrative templates and we'll select, say, printers. Now on the right-hand side, let's just double-click on the top option here, web-based printing, and we'll choose to enable this policy, and we'll click on OK. Now once you've made all of the changes that you need to this policy, we can now close the editor, and if we go back to Windows Explorer and into our Starter GPOs folder, you'll notice now this folder will now contain the GPO that we've just created. Now back in our Group Policy Management console, if we click on Starter GPOs, you'll notice that down the bottom of this window, we've got two buttons here to load and save our Starter GPOs as CAB files. Now this is great because these two buttons lets us save our Starter GPO and then load it on another domain controller, even in another domain or forest. So we don't have to go and create another policy all over again. We can just copy it to another network and load it right in. Now that's something we couldn't do in earlier versions of Windows Server. So now, if we wanted to go and create a DNS server policy, for example, we'll right-click on our DNS server OU. We'll choose to create a GPO in this domain and link it here. I'm going to call this policy DNS. And now when we select the Source Starter GPO drop-down box, we've got the option to use our server role baseline GPO as a starting point, so we're not creating our entire DNS GPO from scratch. So we'll select that, we'll click on OK, and now we'll expand our DNS OU, and we'll right-click on our DNS group policy object, and we'll choose Edit. And if we now go and expand under our computer configuration heading Policies, and then Administrative Templates, and choose Printers, and we'll switch to the standard view so we can see all of the columns, you'll notice that our top option here, web-based printing, is already enabled. Now you can customize the rest of the settings the way you want for DNS only, but our baseline configuration has already been configured for us. And that's great because now we only have to do it once. So this is a really cool new feature of group policy in Windows 2008. And you'll find that it's going to save you a lot of time creating new policies, as a lot of the baseline work you'll only ever need to configure once and then just apply it to new policies as you've just seen. Now so far in this video we've covered pretty much everything you'll need to know as far as the Group Policy Management console goes, but the last thing we'll do in this video is to check out some of the policies that we have in our fingertips. Now obviously this is going to be a quick overview since there's far too many policies to ever cover in even a single series of videos, let alone this one. So while we're here inside our DNS policy, let's go and take a look. Now firstly, at the top of our policy, on the left-hand side here, we can see the object that we're currently editing, which is our DNS policy that's attached to our domain controller DC01. Now underneath our policy name, we have two containers. We have a computer configuration and user configuration containers. The computer configuration contains the settings to set policies that apply to computers, regardless of what user logs onto it, and these policies are applied when the operating system first boots up. Now, the user configuration section contains the settings used to set policies that apply to users, regardless of what computer the user logs onto, and these policies are applied when a user logs onto the computer. So to recap, computer policies only apply to computers. They don't care who logs onto the computer, the policies will still be applied. And user policies follow users around, and they will always apply to users regardless of what computer they happen to log onto. Now we can also see that both of these contain an identical set of subfolders, policies, and preferences, and if we expand both of these out, you'll see the same subfolders here as well, but the further you drill down into these folders, the more differences you'll find. So let's look at our computer configuration section first, and we have 3 subfolders here under the policy section: software settings, where we can manage applications and install them remotely using group policy; Windows settings lets us manage scripts and security settings; and administrative templates contains our registry-based settings. Now, there's literally hundreds of policies we can configure using the group policy object editor, so it's certainly not possible for us to go through them all here, so we'll skip software settings for now, as we have other videos that discusses software. So if we expand Windows settings, and we have 3 sub-options: scripts, security settings, and quality of service. Now, keep in mind as we navigate through the computer configuration section that these policies will only apply to computers, and they'll only be applied when the computer is starting up. So we'll select scripts, and in the right-hand window, we can see we've got 2 options here: start up and shut down. And as obvious as it sounds, we can specify scripts that run when a computer starts up, and scripts that run when a computer is shut down. So if we right-click on Startup and select Properties, this will open up the properties for our startup scripts, and currently we don't have any scripts defined, so to add one, we'll click on the Add button, and then we can simply browse and locate a script that we'd like to run, as well as any optional script parameters. Now the Show Files button down the bottom here is going to take us to the default location where our script files are stored. Now, regarding this file path at the top here, you'll notice if I scroll across to the left here, that it defaults to the name of our domain, winstructorlab.com, in the sysvol folder, followed by winstructorlab.com again, policies, and then the unique name of the policy, which I won't read all of that out, and then followed by machine, scripts, and startup. Now, the reason I wanted to point this out, the sysvol folder that you might be familiar with is included in Active Directory replication. So storing our scripts in this location is a good idea, especially when we have domain controllers dotted around the globe that all need to run the same script. That way, if the script happens to be changed, then all domain controllers that replicate this information is also going to have the new script automatically. Now the shutdown option is exactly the same as our startup option. Obviously, it just refers to when the computer shuts down, so we won't go through that. So let's move on to security settings. So if we expand security settings, you can see here that we do have quite a few options. Under account policies, we can configure our password policies and account lockout policies. If we expand local policies, we can also configure auditing of objects such as files and folders and things like logons. We can configure user rights, such as whether a user can use terminal services, backup files and directories, or log on locally. And then we have security options where we can restrict users from, say, accessing the CD-ROM or loading unsigned drivers. Under event log, we can configure how big we'll allow our event logs to grow. We can prevent people from accessing event logs as well, and specify how long we'll keep those logs for. The next option, restricted groups, allows us to modify the groups that we want to be restricted to certain members. So, for example, if an administrator goes and adds a couple of other users to the administrators group, we could use this policy to reset the administrators group back to the way that we want it to be, so it only contains those members that it should contain. So to configure restricted groups, we'll simply right-click on it and then choose Add Group, And we can either enter in the name of the group or click on the Browse button and then Advanced and Find Now. So for argument's sake, let's just select our administrators group and then click on OK and OK again. Now once we click OK here, it's going to bring up a new dialog box where we can individually add members into our restricted policy by simply clicking on the Add button and then again browsing for the members that we want to add to this group. So let's add in a user. We'll type in TI and hit check names and we'll add in Tim and we'll click on OK. And now once we click on OK, Tim will be added to the administrators group and anyone else who happens to be added to the administrators group is going to be removed once this policy has been refreshed. Now, by the way, if we double click back on this administrators group again, we can also add down the bottom here other groups that our administrators group should also be a member of as well. So this restricted groups feature allows us to ensure that if any changes are made to our group structure, then group policy is going to put it back the way it should be. Now the next option we have here is system services, and this is where we can set the startup state of Windows services. So say for example, we don't want our servers to be using the application experience service. We can double click on it and choose to define this policy and set this service to disabled. So it won't start when the server starts. Now, if we click on the edit security button, we can also define permissions using the Windows access control list so users don't have the permission to change our settings. Now, our next object here is the registry where we can browse for permissions. We can set permissions on registry keys. Now, if we right click and choose add key, we can browse for a specific key and then select OK. And then we can use the Windows access control list to control whether users have permissions to be able to modify our registry settings. Now, next we have the file system, and here we can set which permissions users have on specific files and folders. So to add a file or folder, we'll right-click and choose Add File, and then we can browse for a specific file or folder. So let's just select, say, our Windows directory here, and then click on OK. And again, we're presented with a Windows access control list, so we can specify which users have permissions to access this object. Now next we have wired network policies where we can set options for things like single sign-on capabilities and what types of authentication we want to use for wired network clients. We could configure our Windows firewall, inbound and outbound rules. The next option here, network list manager policies, allows us to configure how our computer will behave when it's connected to different types of networks. For example, our domain winstructorlab.com, as well as networks that it doesn't identify. So here you might decide that if your computer can't identify the network, then it should consider it to be a public network where your computer will configure itself to be more secure by turning off network discovery and adjusting the behavior of the Windows firewall. Now in Windows Vista, all this is the function of the Network Location Awareness service, but in Windows 2008, we configure basically the same thing here using these policies. Now next we have wireless network policies, and here we can set up policies that define preferred wireless networks and security options, such as whether we want to use smart cards for logons or web encryption. Next we have public key policies, which we'll discuss in our videos on certificates later on, but this is where you can set things like automatic certificate enrollment settings and trusted root certification authorities. We then have software restriction policies, where we can restrict a user's ability to run certain applications or scripts. Network access protection policies are where we can set up network access protection client policies, and this is something we're going to discuss in later videos, but it's a new security mechanism that lets us force our users to be up to date with patches and antivirus definitions and so forth before they're able to access certain resources in our network. Now next we have IP security policies, and we'll discuss this in detail in our video on IPsec. And of course, this is where we can set IPsec policies. And finally, here we have the policy-based quality of service, which is where we can prioritize certain types of network traffic so critical services always have the bandwidth they need. Now, if we expand administrative templates, and if we just go and expand all of these subfolders here, you can see that we have literally heaps of options here And I'm not going to go through all of them now, as there are hundreds of them. I'm going to leave that up to you. So if you're bored, go and spend some time taking a look through them. Now moving on to our user configuration heading. Again, we've got many of the same subfolders we saw with our computer configuration, but of course, all of these relate to users and not computers. So for example, in Windows settings, if we expand that, we can define log on and log off scripts instead of the startup and shutdown scripts we looked at under the computer configuration. Now there are other settings such as folder redirection, where we can take some common file path such as the user's documents folder, their desktop and start menus, and redirect them to be stored on a file server rather than the local machine. We've also got Internet Explorer options such as pre-populating Internet Explorer with a list of favorites or setting a default home page, predefining users' proxy settings. You could set their security options and which applications are the defaults for things like email and news groups. And like with our computer configuration section, under administrative templates, again, we have hundreds more options for the built-in Windows components. For example, we could prevent users from using Windows Update, so they can't update their own computers with any unapproved updates. Well, we should probably stop here, since some of you might already be asleep, and you probably now understand why I said at the start of this we won't go through everything, because we'll be here for days discussing all of that. But that's the power of group policy. So do yourself a favor and spend some time with group policy, and you'll be amazed at what you can accomplish with a little bit of planning. In this video, we've introduced you to group policy and how it works. We talked about local and domain policies and how they apply to our sites, domains, and OUs. We learned how we can create and link policies and prevent policies from applying by using block inheritance, and to enforce policies as well, and that'll prevent them from being overridden. We also saw how we can apply policies to only specific users and groups, and how we can use Wmi to provide some really granular filtering so you can apply policies to only very specific targets. Finally, we talked about the new starter GPOs and how building a baseline template policy can really save you a lot of time, and then we talked briefly about what sort of policies we have available in Windows Server 2008. We hope you've enjoyed this video and would like to thank you for supporting Winstructor.